Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We are live streaming from our theater at the museum, and we wish you were here in person with us, but we're rather close. We're pretty close, and we like our international community that can join us online. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Christine Abizaid, former Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC. Christy was Director of NCTC until July of 2024. She was the 8th Senate-confirmed Director and the first woman to lead NCTC, the United States government's primary organization that integrates, analyzes, and shares counterterrorism information to address the persistent and evolving threat environment. During the Obama administration, Christie was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. Prior to joining the Office of the Secretary of Defense, she served on the National Security Council staff as both Director for Counterterrorism and Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. She began her government career at the Defense Intelligence Agency's Joint Intelligence Task Force Combating Terrorism and served for 7 years, including time as the Senior Intelligence Analyst in the Afghanistan-Pakistan Division and the Iraq Middle East Division. She deployed several times throughout the Middle East, including a tour as the Senior DIA Counterterrorism Representative in Iraq. Abizaid has received the Office of the Director of National Intelligence Award, the National Military Intelligence Association John T. Hughes Award, and the DIA Meritorious Civilian Service Award. Chris is going to pose a series of questions to Christy that draw upon her expertise. And then after that, Chris and Christy will welcome your questions. And if you've been with us before or if it's your first time, please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We will do our best to get to as many of them as possible, but sometimes that's a challenge when we have such fascinating guests. All right, over to you, Chris.
Amanda, as always, thanks a lot for your great introduction. Welcome to our Spy Chat guests virtually. Thank you for joining this special program today. Finally, Christy, we have an opportunity to be on the stage together. We have a little joke going on. I have followed Christy to speaking events in Las Vegas, in Doha, tonight in New York City regarding 9/11. And the legacy of 9/11, and Sedona, Arizona, I think, and a few other places along the way. So finally, we have you here on Spy Chat, and I'm really excited. We just heard your bio. It's extraordinary, and I commend you. I really appreciate your leadership in the 3.5 years that you served at NCTC. Congratulations. You finished that up in July. You took my calls from time to time, which I was especially grateful for. But congratulations for a job well done for decades, really.
Thank you.
So I wasn't going to ask you this, but because this is a special program this week, the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, so I'd like to cut to the chase on that and just ask if you have any reflections on 9/11 that you can share with our audience.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's such a momentous event for so many of us. It's hard to just sort of share how you feel about this thing that was life-changing for me, certainly, for my family, for so many of us that if we weren't already in government, a lot of us were called to serve to government because of 9/11. You know, if you were in government, your job was different on September 12th than it was on September 11th. You know, I mean, when this anniversary comes every time, I can't help but remember how beautiful a day it was. We had another beautiful day yesterday.
Right.
I can't help but remember the nearly 3,000 people that lost their lives that day. I can't help but think about how it is our job to prevent something like that from ever happening again. And on this September 11th anniversary, the first one since my time at NCTC, I felt really grateful for the people that are still vigilant, still working the counterterrorism problem, that are working across the counterterrorism community, across departments, agencies, across countries, to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. And so, I started my career because of 9/11. I got into government to be part of the fight, and for those still in it, I can't be more grateful.
I appreciate those reflections. My students last night in class asked me to offer some reflections. You're braver than I am. And I said, you're going to hear them from Christy tomorrow because I can't really talk about it today. Yeah. So, excuse me. So I'd like to cut to the chase on October 7th and the impact on counterterrorism. Yeah. But before I do that, I'd like to call out a quote from your former boss, Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. She said, we're moving into an era of perhaps a generational terrorism threat as a result of October 7th and how it may galvanize extremists across the world. So a two-part question. Sure. Could you put a little more clarity or provide a little more clarity on that idea of a generational terrorist threat? And then, and I think I know the answer to this, but is the U.S. counterterrorism enterprise prepared for this generational threat?
Yeah, so thanks for the question on both counts, because I think it's really important as we think about the next decade of our counterterrorism fight that we are really clear-eyed about what that looks like. So October 7th happens, and, first 2 years of my tenure, went about our business as normal. After October 7th, it was a dramatically different environment. The threats that we were tracking multiplied, the different permutations of the threat that we had to be on the lookout for just expanded quite a bit. And this question of what does this next decade of terrorism look like, not just because of Hamas's attack on October 7th, but because of the conflict it precipitated and a number of other sort of geopolitical realities that were coinciding at the same time that generally elevated the global threat environment. But it's interesting because October 7th is defining for the future of the threat, but it happens on top of a baseline that is already quite dynamic. We spent a lot of time actually thinking about how different October 7th how different October 7th is compared to 9/11. Right. On 9/11, you have a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, based in a single part of the world at that time, run by one individual, highly hierarchical organization, very clear in its objectives and its goals for its fight against the West. When Al-Qaeda attacks us on 9/11, you have groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, saying, we want no part of that. That was not us. We don't support it. We're focused on our regional objectives. When Hamas attacks on October 7th, even those not ideologically aligned with it all run to that moment. They see it as validation for political violence. They see it as a way to sort of generate new recruits, find new financiers. It's not just Hamas that gets a bounce. It is Al-Qaeda. Every Al-Qaeda affiliate makes a statement in support of Hamas. ISIS, which hates Hamas, which has denigrated Hamas for years, supports what they have done, cautiously, but still supports it. Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi Shia militant groups, and racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists all find a piece of what Hamas has done, if not the whole thing, something to rally around and something to generate adherence from, and they capitalize on it. And it's that capitalization on top of which, you're also dealing with individuals unaffiliated with any of those organized groups seeing motivation from that attack. That just means you've got an attack surface from your terrorism adversaries, and there are multiple of them, that has just expanded quite a bit. The acceleration of radicalization to mobilization has expanded quite a bit. And as we think about the generational consequences, I mean, we know there will be generational consequences to what happened on October 7th. The question of exactly what shape those will be, I think is still open. Will you have new groups emerge? Probably. Will there be more individuals radicalized and mobilized to violence and terrorism because of this? Almost certainly. How does the Iranian axis of resistance reform in the wake of something like October 7th? You have the Houthis come out of nowhere, really, to present a whole new challenge that is both geopolitical and terrorism at the same time. How do these tactics, techniques, and procedures proliferate? There are so many questions that require us to be really sophisticated as a counterterrorism community to stay in front of. That goes to your second question, which is, are we postured for that? And I think the answer is yes. Now, counterterrorism resources have gone down in the last 5 years plus. And they've gone down from a peak in the post 9/11 era. The job of the counterterrorism community is to, one, understand the threat, have a theory of its future trajectory, and then build in a process where the policymaking community hears from the counterterrorism community about, in a very clear-eyed way, about what it needs to combat what today's threat looks like and what tomorrow's threat will bring. And, I spent the last 3 years of my tenure trying to figure out how we raise the flag when we absolutely need to, how we balance our assessment of the threat so we don't end up overhyping it and then creating a situation where people, don't listen to the warnings that are real about how the threat could metastasize. And so, we always want more. We could always use more. There are certainly pieces of our counterterrorism investment structure that we've got to take a really hard look at and think about, the next technological advancement, the next, collection platform, what have you. But the process exists to make sure that we stay balanced against the threat without overwhelming our national security budget. And so I think we've done that. It's kind of like boring and wonky and bureaucratic to say, but I do think we have created a community where the warnings that we see are the ones that the policymakers then respond to.
I appreciate that clarity, because that was one of the first discussions you and I had. My fear as an outsider early on in your tenure was we were going to overcorrect. So I think there needs to be a rebalancing. I think that'll come up also at our summit in New York, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it requires constant tending to, right? This balance is a hard thing to strike, and you don't strike it once and never have to go back to it.
Right.
You are constantly in a conversation. And if it's a healthy intelligence community, CT community relationship with the policymaker, you are in constant dialogue about what's needed to deal with the threat, and you're staying ahead of it. And that's honestly one of the hardest parts of the job.
And that's a key question, or a key answer, really. You well informed by intelligence, right?
Always.
So let me transition a little bit, and Christy isn't going to talk a lot about the domestic threat, but I think it's worth reminding the audience that there were just a conviction of 3 individuals on the west coast of the United States that were planning to go after a power grid, or not a grid, but actually a power station. Mm-hmm. And they were convicted. They had white supremacist ideological leanings. They were linked to neo-Nazi groups. So that's here domestically, but we've seen that there's a transitional, or not a transitional, that too, but there is a transnational trajectory of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. So if you can talk about that in terms of the threat and how you square that with Islamist terrorists, if you could talk about that for a moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mentioned in the context of, all those reacting to the October 7th attacks. And I mean, the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist threat is it's fundamentally a transnational threat. We tend to think about it here in the United States as a problem of domestic terrorism. There are pieces of it that merge with anti-authority and anti-government groups. But when you have racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists here in the United States conducting attacks at a supermarket in Buffalo that kills Black Americans, in El Paso at a Walmart, right? Church shootings, attacks at synagogues, and then inspiring similar events overseas, fundamentally inspired by a Christchurch attack against a mosque, or a terrible attack in Norway by Breivik. These are not ideologies. These are not ideas that are, just in the United States. And actually, this week I was reading the news. The Department of Justice just dropped charges against this organization, these two Americans in an organization called the Telegram Network. It's what they were involved in was inciting violence against minorities, against Jewish people, against Black people, and doing it all over the world. The attack in Bratislava, Slovakia, is tied to a Telegram network that is being administered in part here in the United States that has adherents in other parts of the world. You see some of the incidents that have occurred worldwide. There's an incident in Australia. There's one in Brazil. There are incidents that happen in different parts of Europe. And so one of the things that we actually tried really hard to do at NCTC is not be so narrow in our definition of what's happening here in the United States without understanding the inextricable link to groups that are fundamentally transnational. NCTC was born to be an organization that looks across the foreign-domestic divide, that understands trends in transnational terrorism so it can get ahead of them, and that, and we worked really hard to organize international conversations about how all of our partners, especially in the West, were dealing with this phenomenon of racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism. It's a really important threat. It's very difficult for us to get our arms around and organize with the tools that we used against Al-Qaeda or ISIS, because it's a leaderless sort of it's a leaderless concept of organizational violence. It's not hierarchical. There are not sort of defined groups other than in very rare circumstances. You've got a lot of concerns about politicized speech and privacy rights that are all fair and right. And so we've got to get creative about what parts of our post 9/11 framework allow us to deal with this new version, not new version, but certainly transnational version of this threat, and what parts do we need to evolve as it continues.
So, Christy, you used the word creative in the context of domestic violent extremists. What about ISISK as an example? Of course, they attacked the Moscow concert hall. Colin Clark and I wrote a piece in the New York Times expressing our concerns. It got our attention. But one of the questions that we teased out and addressed, in fact, was this idea of potential cooperation with the Taliban. And I've heard you speak about this before. So
what did I say? Was it approved?
the potential for ISIS-K to be, or I'm sorry, for the Taliban to be partners against ISIS-K.
Yeah.
That would be creative. It would create some problems as well. It would be highly politicized. That's my assessment. But is there the possibility, do you see a world where the Taliban would cooperate with the United States in terms of working against ISIS-K?
Yeah, I mean, look, leaving aside the question of formal cooperation, it's clearly in our shared interests to deal with the ISIS Khorasan threat. And in fact, if you look at how the Taliban has sort of prioritized security in Afghanistan after August of 2021, you know, they've viewed ISIS Khorasan as their number one threat. And they have done a lot to counter that threat. In fact, a couple years in, we saw them push some of the most concerning elements out of Afghanistan. And it's forced this evolution in ISIS-K's model of operating, but also, I mean, I think it applies to other parts of the ISIS network where you're not hubbed out of, you're not led out of Iraq and Syria like you have been. These branches that have grown out of the original sort of caliphate experiment from ISIS are now actually much more active than anything you see out of Iraq and Syria. You have ISIS in West Africa. You have ISIS-K out of South and Central Asia. And then you see sort of this investment in propaganda, especially by a group like ISIS-K, propaganda not just in Urdu and Arabic, but in Tajik languages, in English, in European languages, in a way that is trying to tap in not into recruits that are coming to their safe haven hub necessarily, but recruits that are already in places they want to attack and that they want to inspire to attack. And so, before the Olympics and, we even saw it with a Taylor Swift concert, you see these disruptions of these individuals that have adherence to ISIS ideals and that have been inspired to try and plan attacks against, Western societies. We had a disruption here in the United States of Tajiks with ties to ISIS overseas. And, it's that kind of virtual outreach model that ISIS did from Iraq and Syria in the early days of the post-2014 era, and that we've really got to worry about their affiliates modeling once again and trying to sort of gain foothold. You look at something like that Moscow attack, you don't have to be, launched out of Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran to make that happen. You just have to be in touch with the right operatives and give them the right guidance, the right target selection, and something devastating can occur. And that's the kind of sort of low-risk investment that we've got to worry about from the total ISIS network, but especially ISIS-K right now, so that we can protect against it. And it's a difficult challenge.
I appreciate that. So final question, then I'm going to offer a book recommendation. So I don't know how much you can say about this, even though you've left the government. You're going to be mindful of your responsibilities, as we are here. Oh, great.
So this is going to be a tricky one.
No, it should be okay. With the media, there was some media reporting that the Biden administration alerted the Secret Service that there was assassination planning, and someone directed to look at assassinating President Trump. It had nothing to do with what we saw play out in Pennsylvania. That said, it really underscores Iran just will not go away in terms of the kind of threat that they are projecting. In fact, as an aside, this morning I saw in the Washington Post an article about Iran maybe working with surrogates such as the Hells Angels, was that right?
Yeah, I saw
motorcycle
that.
gangs,
Yeah,
criminal organizations, right?
Yeah,
as surrogates. And we already know Iran is engaged in proxy warfare. Now we're talking about a whole different dimension. So some of this threat started as a result of the Qasem Soleimani strike in 2020 that President Trump directed, where Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, was killed in Baghdad. And Iran has vowed to seek revenge. Can you talk a little bit about that threat, how you see Iran, the persistence of them posing a CT threat? It's fairly bold.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I've said it's bold. I think Iran and its pursuit of these sort of transnational operations is more brazen than we've seen since, the 80s and 90s when this was their brand. And that they're willing to sort of work with just about anyone that will try and execute on their goals is really concerning. I saw the Post Article 2 that was about, transnational repression and getting after dissidents, which they've tried to do in this country. They successfully did it decades ago in this country, I think in Bethesda. But now they're doing it, and they're doing it, trying to do it at scale. And there's no doubt in my mind that a persistent strategic goal of the supreme leader is that they will retaliate for the death of Qasem Soleimani. They will seek to exact revenge on officials that they have deemed responsible. And, I think just recently another DOJ charge dropped against an individual with ties to Iran here in the country that was planning to conduct political assassinations against, former and current U.S. officials. It's that they have a surrogate strategy and a proxy strategy in the Middle East where they have created in Hezbollah and then a number of Iraqi Shia militant groups, and increasingly, as I mentioned, the Houthis, sort of and to some extent the Palestinians, like Hamas, though it's a little bit different a relationship. They've created this capability that extends Iran's reach and goal for hegemony in the region. Beyond that, as they look to extend their reach outside of the region, they are willing to work with those groups and just about anyone else to find ways to meet their objectives. And it is persistent and it is strategic. And while certain conditions in the Middle East might change immediate calculus for escalation or otherwise, we have got to expect that they will be seeking to avenge the death of Soleimani, that they will be targeting former U.S. government officials, until they think they've met their objective. And we have got to really work hard on a deterrent strategy that makes it clear that there are very, very significant consequences to this persistent demand from them.
Right, employing a deterrent strategy that raises the costs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not if, it's when. That's concerning. So thanks for taking that question. I appreciate that. So now my book recommendation. So part of my remarks when Christy and I are both separately speaking in New York City, talking about some reflections on 9/11 and counterterrorism. One of the book recommendations I have is directly linked to what seems a little cliche these days. People talk about the perfect storm for the potential for political violence. And on Spy Chat, we are certainly not hyperbolic, we're not hysterical, but at the same time, it's important for us to ensure that we're well informed. So I picked up a book because although it might not be a perfect storm, a foreign partner, an intelligence officer said, Chris, we really think it's the calm before the storm. So we will see. I hope this individual is wrong. But The Storm is Here is the title of the book by Luke Mogelson. And I picked it up and I started reading it. I don't know if you could see it, but it's my recommendation. I think it's worth reading. The subtitle is An American Crucible. I think it's important to hear perspectives on the potential for political violence. As sober as that topic is, I think it's important and it's relevant. So unless you have any final comments, we're going to go right to questions and answers, which is really the fun part, because this is when our audience gets to answer curated or ask curated questions. Over to you, Amanda.
All right, well, Christy, we warned you we might ask you for a book recommendation if you're willing to share one.
Sure, I am. So maybe I'll share two. One is a book that really helped me understand Afghanistan in a completely different way, which is Stephen Cole's Ghost Wars. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like a classic for any of those that are interested. It talks about sort of the run-up to 9/11 and what Afghanistan really meant to what became the next 2 decades of American foreign policy. So it's really well done, and it's a throwback, but you should do it. On the theme that you were just talking about, and just to clarify, the National Counterterrorism Center is not in the business of analyzing purely domestic counterterrorism. It's something that we were built for the foreign domestic divide. We were built to understand transnational dynamics of terrorism. But it's been made clear that purely domestic terrorism should be within the remit of DHS and FBI, and they do a very good job of it. It's incredible to see what they do all the time. That means that I couldn't get educated by the amazing experts at NCTC about this threat in the way that I always wanted to, and so one of the books that I turned to just understand it better is Bruce Hoffman's recent book, along with Jacob Ware, who will be there tomorrow, I think, as well. It's God, Guns, and Sedition. Is that right?
That's right. God, Guns, and Sedition.
Yeah, God, Guns, and Sedition. And it is a really helpful primer, really history of what we're dealing with today, but the roots all the way back to when Bruce started his career, looking at Oklahoma City bombing and Waco and so much of what was true about the country then. And so I commend that to you, that title to you, certainly.
Thanks for that recommendation. It's I've integrated that book into my class at Georgetown, and my students are hopefully reading it from cover to cover.
I guess you'll find out, yeah.
We will find out. Thanks for that, Christy. Let's go ahead and take some questions.
So we did discuss earlier today that January 6th, DHS has designated that a national security day. Do you think some of these groups you've discussed today, will foreign entities try to take advantage and sort of hijack January 6th?
I wouldn't read into DHS designating that day as a sign that they have indications that that's actually going to be the case. There are almost certainly going to be sort of malign influence efforts to sort of take that date on and the infamy that surrounds it. But really, the way that I read DHS's decision, and I wasn't in government when they made it, is really one of preparedness. And it's exactly the right kind of preparedness that our government should be looking out for. How do you look at an event like that, the importance to our democracy, and make sure that you're doing everything you can to prepare for the worst and hope that any threats that materialize are things that you can deal with pretty quickly and effectively because you have the resources necessary. So that's how I read DHS's decision.
Can you speak to how much current support you believe Hamas is receiving from other terror groups? And just a tiny question, is it actually possible to eradicate Hamas?
Oof. So Hamas is almost certainly benefiting from cooperation with other terrorist groups, especially in Gaza. We see it with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They have a longstanding relationship with Lebanese Hezbollah. The degree to which Iran is supportive generally of what Hamas is trying to do and their survival strategy. If you look at everything that's happening outside of Gaza with the Houthis, with the Iraqi Shia militant groups, with Hezbollah on the northern border, with Iran's support to that sort of proxy network, that is the fundamental support that Hamas is getting from the axis of resistance. The future of Hamas is a very, very tricky thing. It has been around forever. Well, not forever, but it's been around for quite a long time. It has created in itself not just terrorist objectives, but also governance objectives that have embedded in society in Gaza in a way that's going to make it very, very difficult to eradicate as an organization and eradicate as really an idea. And so when I think about the important objectives in Gaza vis-a-vis Hamas, it's about dismantling its capability to conduct terrorist attacks. There's a lot about Hamas that isn't fundamentally focused on terrorist capability projection. And, how you do that in one of the most intense urban environments that include tunnel systems and just incredibly challenging territory that has resulted in really harrowing consequences for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, it is an extremely, extremely devastating challenge. And so, I have a real challenge in thinking about a total eradication of Hamas that doesn't harm Palestinian civilians in a way that is completely unacceptable.
And for what it's worth, I agree with everything Christy just said about eradicating Hamas. It's going to be exceedingly difficult, if impossible, to completely eradicate them. And I would just offer to the listener that offered the question that defeating ISIS, there was a lot of hyperbole about the complete destruction, eradication. Back in 2017, yes, we took the physical caliphate away from ISIS, but we didn't defeat them. They have metastasized, they have morphed, they have become something else. So it is exceedingly difficult. It has to be worked in tandem with attacking sort of the underlying ideological tenets, and it's a challenge. It's vexed all of us for years.
It's such a great point, Chris. I mean, I have hesitated in the role that I had at NCTC to talk about eradication or ultimate defeat, or these absolutist sort of descriptions of dealing with persistent ideologies and permutations of a threat that mean that look, let's not assume away that the adversary. Terrorism is a persistent challenge. There will be different forms of it that challenge us in different ways at different times, but we are always going to need a counterterrorism capability that keeps Americans safe, that stays on the edge of the threat and stays ahead of the threat. And to act as though there is a date certain by which it's no longer important really is a recipe for a strategic surprise that we don't want our American citizens to have to deal with, or global citizens to have to deal with. And so I am a big proponent of the eternal vigilance mission of our counterterrorism community, doing it right, not doing it so that it completely bloats our national security structure or takes over other national security aims. But it is a challenge that requires constant attention, and we should be really grateful, as I said at the beginning, for those that are still doing it.
That's right. This ties back to the ethos, protecting the nation from those threats and our foreign partners. What else do we have, Amanda?
Yeah, this plays very well into that. Given the evolving landscape of global terrorism and intelligence, how do you both assess the effectiveness of current counterterrorism strategies compared to those from the early 2000s? Are there particular lessons or strategies from your experiences that you believe should be emphasized or reevaluated in today's context? And if one of Chris's students asks that, they should get an A.
I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, Chris.
So I'll take us back to the 2018 strategy on counterterrorism, which lasted a long time until really the last year or so.
And also was the first to call out the domestic terrorism
And
threat.
that's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
No. Thank you for calling that out, because I'm going to remind the 1,000 people that are in New York tomorrow, we didn't get a lot of credit for that, but it was the counterterrorism professionals that made sure we built in the language to focus on white supremacy at an international level and a transnational level. So I think, again, it comes down to having a balanced strategy. And I was proud of the fact that there were a lot of knockdown, drag-out fights that I would never share publicly because it doesn't matter. That's what happens, as you know, in the policy debates. But what was produced was a policy that was balanced and focused on the domestic threat as well as jihadist terrorists or Islamist violent Islamist terrorists, however we couched it. So I think, though, one of the tenets that's underappreciated and that none of us have figured out, going back to the Bush strategy through the present day, is how do we get at what you already talked about, the ideological underpinnings.
Yeah.
And we haven't got to that,
Yeah.
at least successfully. It's very challenging. So I would say that we have to continue, as we alluded to in the 2018 strategy, we have to still continue to pressure our adversaries overseas with on occasion, direct action, making sure we minimize civilian casualties. We built all that into the language.
Yeah.
At the same time, we also were cognizant, and I see it in the current Biden administration, the idea that the United States wanted to be very cognizant that we don't want to contribute to making more terrorists. We have to minimize civilian casualties. So those are some of my takeaways. And I would just make the point to our audience that shortly after the Biden administration took the helm of the government, there was the domestic violent extremism strategy that was published in the first few months of the administration.
That's right.
I think it was very necessary
Yeah.
to frame the domestic violent extremist strategy and threat, frankly.
Yeah, but again, I mean that was really important Biden administration policy work that built off of work that you were doing in the Trump administration. And I think what your comments point out is, despite sort of the rhetoric around terrorism in any given election cycle, what you see out of the United States government is a real through line in counterterrorism strategy that sort of meets the challenge of the time and respects the work that preceded it, regardless of the political persuasion of the party in charge. I mean, there is a consistency in the seriousness with which the counterterrorism community takes the threat and then engages with decision makers, operators, policymakers on what we've got to do about that threat. I think your ideology point is a really good one. And the other challenge that I don't know that we have a solution for is sort of the mode of making that ideology resonant, right? Like the social media outreach, the groups that exist in these small encrypted channels, the degree to which so much of the sort of recruitment and radicalization is sort of, vectored toward young men in online communities, like how we combat not just the groups that are charged that are attempting to attack us, but the individuals that are emerging from these sort of ideas to take it upon themselves, this mantle of resistance and political violence. That is a really, really difficult challenge. And right now, the terrorism environment is so diffuse and disaggregated that we both have to continue our high-value target strategy. We have to continue to understand what our military options are against al-Shabaab or ISIS or others. We have to understand the escalatory consequences that occur in the dynamic between Israel and Iran and how that affects the terrorism environment. And then we have to figure out sort of this law enforcement-led, but very difficult to predict, individual motivated to act that is very, very hard to get in front of. And they might result in less sophisticated attacks, but the number of attacks, it's just really concerning. And so that is a piece of our counterterrorism strategy that interacts with the law enforcement community, that interacts with the online social media environment, that really is targeted toward sort of radicalizing those most vulnerable and susceptible to messaging. That is a real challenge of today's terrorism threat.
And if I could put a finer point on the idea of continuity, the staying arc of